Today's episode contains a brief mention of sexual assault and harassment. It also contains graphic descriptions of slavery. We have included these descriptions for historical accuracy, but we do advise our listeners to listen at your own discretion. What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Today, our tale takes us to 18th century England, to an extravagant estate called Kenwood House in London's Hampstead Heath. It is here where England's most powerful judge, the Lord Chief Justice Murray, once resided, with his wife and two adopted nieces. Though on the surface Kenwood House likened the traditional English estate, there was someone incredibly unusual living within its walls. A young biracial woman born into slavery, taken in by one of the most powerful aristocratic families in England, and being raised as a gentlewoman. Listeners, today I introduce you to Dido Elizabeth Belle, England's first female aristocrat of color. Dido was born at the height of the transatlantic slave trade to an enslaved mother and white father, a British naval officer stationed in the West Indies during the 7 Years' War. It's believed that Dido's father found her mother on a ship he captured in the Caribbean, where she was being held as a slave. He took her in as a private servant and inevitably lover, as she became pregnant soon after, a conception we can only imagine was not entirely consensual. We do not know the exact circumstances surrounding Dido's birth, and whether she was born at sea or somewhere in the West Indies. But because her mother was a slave and Dido was illegitimate, it would not have been unusual for her to be left on a plantation as a domestic servant. Instead, her father made the radical choice to bring Dido and her mother back with him to England, changing her destiny from one of servitude to one of fortune. Because her father was unmarried and would inevitably be called back to sea, he decided to leave the young Dido under the care of his uncle, William Murray. It was the perfect solution. Dido would be well provided for, and Murray and his wife, who were unable to have children, were happy to take Dido in as their own. Dido was raised at Kenwood House alongside another of Murray's nieces, Lady Elizabeth Murray, whose mother had unexpectedly passed away. Despite being both biracial and illegitimate, the Murrays nonetheless treated Dido as a member of their own family, providing her with an extensive education, luxurious accommodations, and an annual allowance. She and Lady Elizabeth were treated as equals and companions, regardless of their difference in race. The idea that a biracial child born into slavery was now being raised as a member of an aristocratic family was completely unheard of, especially considering that slavery was both still legal and at the core of England's economy. And if this wasn't incredulous enough, it just so happened that Dido had landed in one of the most influential households in the country. William Murray had recently been appointed as the Lord Chief Justice, the most powerful judge in all of England. Throughout Dido's childhood, Murray presided over several pivotal cases pertaining to slavery. And despite much protest, he overwhelmingly sided with slaves, pronouncing slavery as odious and granting slaves important legal protection. Many believe that Dido's presence in his home influenced Murray's decisions, and that his care for her shifted not only his own beliefs towards slavery, but inspired him to put into place the legal stepping stones that would eventually pave the way towards abolition. And it does seem that Murray was especially fond of Dido. He found her exceptionally intelligent and responsible, and often proudly gushed about her to his associates. As she grew older, he gave Dido important responsibilities within the household, like running the estate's dairy farm. And in his late age, she helped him with all of his correspondence, transcribing letters on his behalf, letters that would have been sent to England's most powerful men and contain matters of the utmost importance. And perhaps the greatest indication of Murray's adoration is in the sole existent portrait we have of Dido. Commissioned by Murray in 1776, the portrait shows Dido alongside Lady Elizabeth. Unlike the standard depictions of black men and women at the time, in which they were largely shown in subordinate positions, Dido is pictured as Lady Elizabeth's equal. She playfully runs past Lady Elizabeth holding a basket of fruit as she smiles mysteriously at the viewer, a smile so enthralling that it rivals the Mona Lisa's. When Murray died in 1793, he not only left Dido a sizable annuity, but ensured her safety by officially granting her her freedom. Murray's will is a dark reminder that despite how protected she was at his estate, to the outside world, Dido was still considered a slave. After Murray's death, Dido was forced to leave Kenwood House, the place she had called home for over 30 years. A few months later, she married a French servant named John d'Avennières, who was likely working at the estate. She used the money she inherited from Murray to buy them a home in a middle-class community, and they together went on to have 3 sons. Tragically, Dido died in 1804 of unknown causes, at the age of 43. She did not live long enough to see slavery abolished in England, which would not take place until 30 years after her death. Dido's life story is undeniably remarkable. That a woman born into slavery could later be raised as a member of an important aristocratic family at the height of the transatlantic slave trade was virtually unheard of. And more than this, that her presence in the home of the Lord Chief Justice of England may have impacted his rulings that eventually paved the way towards abolition, is utterly extraordinary. But though Dido was in many ways the exception, her story cannot be removed from the dark history of slavery itself. It is essential that Dido's life is understood within the context of the time she lived. And while we honor Dido and her incredible life, we also honor the lives of the innumerable black men and women whose stories have been unfairly lost to history. So without further ado, let's dive in to the phenomenal life of Dido Elizabeth Belle. Though we do not know the exact circumstances surrounding Dido's birth, it's believed that she was born sometime in the year of 1761. Her father, Sir John Lindsay, came from an aristocratic Scottish family. From an early age, Sir John Lindsay proved to be a proficient sailor, and he joined the English army at the age of 20 to fight in the 7 Years' War. It didn't take long for him to be promoted to the admirable position of lieutenant and given a fire ship to command in the British West Indies. Commanding a fire ship was no easy task, as it was a ship filled with explosives with the mission of blowing up in enemy territory. Luckily for Sir John Lindsay, and for the purpose of our story, his ship never reached the point of explosion. Instead, he spent a few years patrolling the waters around the West Indies and West Africa, docking in places like Senegal, Gambia, and Jamaica. A naturally brazen and impulsive man, Sir John Lindsay often captured French and Spanish merchant ships in these waters, mounting prizes significant enough to get him attention back in England. It was on one of these captured ships that Sir Captain Lindsay first came across a young enslaved woman named Maria Belle, who was being held as a slave on board. We do not know exactly where the ship was captured, but records show that he was sailing between the coasts of Senegal and the Caribbean around this time. It's believed that the ship belonged to the Spanish, as we also know that in 1761, the same year Dido was later born, Sir Captain Lindsay captured 2 Spanish ships. Maria Belle was likely one of many slaves being held captive by the Spanish on board. We do not know exactly where Maria was originally from, but it's probable that she was taken from West Africa as part of the transatlantic slave trade to work in one of the many sugar plantations across the West Indies. The transatlantic slave trade was nothing short of horrific. Families were torn apart, and terrified men, women, and children were degraded and dehumanized as they were seized and paraded around as property. We can only imagine that Maria suffered the same harrowing fate as many other captured slaves from this time. Though we do not know the specifics of Maria's capture, nor the circumstances aboard the Spanish ship, we can get a sense of what her experience was like from first-hand accounts of slave ships from this time. Known as floating dungeons, slave ships traveling across the transatlantic were full of horrors, so atrocious that they are near indescribable. Men and women were stripped completely naked, chained together, and piled into cramped spaces. As a reverend named Robert Walsh observed on a Spanish slave ship from around this time, "How is it possible for such a number of human beings to exist, packed up and wedged together as tight as they could cram, shut out from light or air? And on top of these inhumane conditions, female slaves in particular were susceptible to widespread sexual assault. It was not uncommon for sailors stuck at sea for months at a time to assault and rape female slaves. As resisting these advances often meant violent consequences, many of these women succumbed to assaults in an effort to stay alive, as fellow slaves looked on horrified. Some of these female victims were as young as 9 years old. Because we know that Maria was around 14 when Captain Lindsay first encountered her, it's more than likely that Maria herself had experienced some form of sexual harassment or assault aboard the Spanish ship. It's important now, as we describe the meeting of Sir Captain Lindsay and Maria Belle, that we do our best to separate fact from fantasy. As the legend goes, upon capturing the ship, Sir Captain Lindsay took an immediate liking to Maria and sought to rescue her from her desperate situation. But this reading feeds into the problematic white savior complex, painting Sir Captain Lindsay as some kind of hero. A far more likely scenario is that Lindsay took Maria in as a personal servant on his ship. It was not all that uncommon for female slaves to be favored by a captain, given less intensive work and generally treated better than other slaves. This arrangement also would have given Captain Lindsay ample opportunity to spend one-on-one time with Maria, and to engage in sexual relations. While we do not know the exact nature of their connection, it's disappointing how many historic tellings of their meeting suggest that their relationship could have been consensual. Given the obvious power disparity between Captain Lindsay and Maria, it's both unrealistic and unfair to assume that Maria had mutual feelings for Captain Lindsay. As author Paula Byrne wrote, "Can a relationship between a white captain and a slave woman within the British Empire in the 18th century ever be considered anything other than sexual exploitation? Could there ever be a consensual relationship between black and white, slave and captain?" Because Maria's own feelings and experience have been lost to history, we are left with only questions in their wake. How did Maria feel about Captain Lindsay? Was she terrified of him? Or were there glimmers of affection? Did she feel safe in his presence? Or did she succumb to his advances as a means of survival? And how did Maria feel when she realized that she was pregnant with his child? As Paula Byrne continued, "We simply do not know if Dido Belle was conceived by force, by mutual consensual passion, or as a duty that might bring material benefits to Maria, otherwise powerless." The mystery surrounding Dido's conception and birth leave us only with more questions. We do not know exactly when Dido was born, though it's generally accepted that she was born sometime in 1761, nor if she was born at sea or in the West Indies, though many presume that she was born in the captain's cabin of Lindsay's ship. Interestingly, there is reason to believe that Dido and Maria lived at sea with Captain Lindsay on his ship through Dido's infancy, and that Dido may have unknowingly bore witness to a historic battle. In September of 1762, Captain Lindsay sailed to Havana in an effort to seize the city from the Spanish. We know that he played a vital role in taking the Morro Castle, a major victory for the British, which led to the Spanish's surrender of the city. While it's unlikely that Maria and Dido would have been on the battle line, it's very possible that Lindsay kept them on his ship docked nearby. And if so, that Maria would have played her own vital role in tending to wounded soldiers. Was baby Dido there to witness the historic capture of Havana? Was Maria worried for her and her baby's safety? Or did she feel a sense of purpose and importance while she tended to English soldiers? The possibility that Maria and baby Dido were witness to Britain's seizure of Havana, one of the most pivotal battles of the entire 7 Years' War, is utterly remarkable. Now, it's important to remember that while Maria and Dido remained with Captain Lindsay on his ship, Maria was still enslaved, and her and Dido's future were completely in his hands. Though mixed race, Dido also would have been considered a slave, and Maria must have feared for her daughter's grim fate. Knowing that Captain Lindsay would one day have to return to England, it would not have been unreasonable for Maria to assume that she and her baby could be sold as slaves elsewhere. Captain Lindsay very easily could have set Maria up as a domestic servant at one of the many plantations in the West Indies, where Dido would have been raised to be a household slave. Or more humanely, he would have had enough money to buy Maria's freedom and leave her and Dido in the West Indies to start a new life for themselves. Both of these scenarios would have kept his relationship with Maria, and more importantly, their illegitimate child, a secret from his family, and protected him from societal scorn. So it comes with much surprise that when Captain Lindsay was called to return back to England in 1765, he made the radical choice to bring Maria and Dido with him. This was not only an extremely unusual and bold arrangement, it was a deliberate decision to not abandon his daughter and subject her to a life of slavery. It would no doubt shock his friends and family and garner him much public shame, but Captain Lindsay was willing to face society's judgment to ensure his daughter a brighter future. And while we do not know the exact reasoning behind Captain Lindsay's decision, there is no doubt that he had developed genuine care for both Maria and Dido, and that his emotional attachment to them must have played a big part. How did Maria feel as they sailed towards England? Could she believe that she and Dido had been spared the worst of fates? That her daughter would now have a chance at a better life? We can only imagine how relieved Maria must have been as she and little Dido accompanied Captain Lindsay towards a new land, and better yet, a new life. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
Did you know that Cary Grant would send a bill to house guests that overstayed their welcome? Did you know that Flo Ziegfeld used to wash Billy Burke's hair with expensive champagne? Or that Jean Harlow was only 26 years old when she died? How about Frank Sinatra being banned from Marilyn Monroe's funeral? Stars of the Golden Age is a podcast that dives deep into the lives of your favorite old Hollywood stars, where you can learn interesting things like this and so much more. My name is Erin Carlson, and each week I will take you on a journey through another life of one of Hollywood's greats. Learn about Vivien Leigh, Humphrey Bogart, Grace Kelly, Jane Mansfield, James Dean, Katharine Hepburn, Olivia de Havilland, and so many more. Together, we can learn about these stars, what made them tick, and how events in their early lives affected them as adults. Find Stars of the Golden Age on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes every Tuesday. Listen to Stars of the Golden Age now.
Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Knowing that he would soon be called back to sea, once they arrived in England, Captain Lindsay arranged for Dido to live with his uncle, William Murray Mansfield. Captain Lindsay was particularly close to his uncle and entrusted him with Dido's safety. But as fate would have it, his uncle was not just a trusted elder. He was also one of the most powerful and well-known men in all of England. William Murray Mansfield was born in 1705 in Scotland. A natural learner, he moved to England at the age of 13 to study at the prestigious Westminster School, and later studied law at Oxford University. Soon after graduating, he met a woman named Elizabeth Finch, whom he married in 1738. Their marriage marked the first of many breaks with convention that the Mansfields would make in their lives, and may help explain why many years later they would be open to taking in a child born into slavery. Elizabeth Finch was significantly older than William Murray, and already in her mid-30s, which for the time would have been considered well past her childbearing days. In fact, most women her age would have been written off as spinsters, and her marriage to a younger, aspiring lawyer certainly raised eyebrows. But despite its unusualness, William and Elizabeth's marriage was extremely heartfelt. She became his closest confidant and supported his career as he rose the ranks of England's judicial department William was promoted to Solicitor General, later Attorney General, and eventually, in 1756, he became the Lord Chief Justice, the most powerful judge in all of England. He was thereafter given a position in Parliament, and the English government depended on him to advise on both domestic and international law. Which brings us to the important question: why would such a powerful and influential man, well-versed in law, take in the biracial, illegitimate child of his nephew, when slavery was still very much legal? The most obvious answer is that William and his wife were childless. This comes as no surprise, given that Elizabeth was in her mid-30s when they got married, and would have been in her mid-50s by the time Dido arrived. We can only imagine that their inability to have children was hard, especially on Elizabeth, and that they may have been keen to finally be able to raise a child as their own. It was likely for this same reason that William and Elizabeth took in another young girl around the same time as Dido, Lady Elizabeth Mansfield. Like Dido, Lady Elizabeth was also William's great niece, and technically Dido's second cousin. The Mansfields took in Lady Elizabeth when she was only 6 years old, after her mother unexpectedly died and her father suffered a nervous breakdown. We do not know if Dido or Lady Elizabeth were the first to arrive with the Mansfields at Kenwood House. If Lady Elizabeth arrived first, then it's possible that Dido was taken in to be her playmate, and perhaps later in life her attendant. It's equally possible that Dido was the first to arrive and Lady Elizabeth was taken in shortly afterwards. Whether Lady Elizabeth's presence was one of the reasons the Mansfields took Dido in or not, it certainly was fate that the two girls could be raised together. Just 1 year apart, Dido and Lady Elizabeth quickly became the closest of companions, and would stand by each other's side as sisters for the next 20 years. Our inability to determine which girl was taken in first is largely because we do not know exactly when Dido initially came to Kenwood House. The earliest surviving document on Dido we have is her baptism record from November of 1766, which stated, "Dido Elizabeth, daughter of Belle and Maria, aged 5 years." It would be safe to assume that Dido was baptized when she first entered Lord Mansfield's house, aging her at around 5. We do not know if she was renamed at this time or if Dido was the name her mother gave her at birth, as Dido was a common name for female slaves. It is likely that the Mansfields added her second name Elizabeth as an attempt to make Dido sound more cultivated. Absent from the record is of course Captain Lindsay, who despite his radical choice to bring Dido to England, still did not want to publicly acknowledge her as his child. Instead, Dido was given her mother's last name, Belle, which raises another important question. What happened to Dido's mother, Maria, once they arrived in England? We know from the record that Maria was present at the baptism, but we do not know if Maria lived with Dido up until this point, nor where she went once Dido officially moved into Kenwood House, as there is no evidence to indicate that Maria joined Dido with the Mansfields. We can only imagine how painful it must have been for Maria to leave Dido, even if she knew it ensured her daughter a brighter future. And at 5 years old, Dido was old enough to have formed a deep connection with her mother, and must have been both saddened and confused to be separated from her. Though we do not know exactly where Maria lived, nor what her status or occupation was, records show that she remained in London for another 7 years. As she was still technically a slave, we can imagine that she worked in some form of domestic service. As any mother would, Maria stayed in as much touch with Dido as she could, and watched from afar as Dido was raised into an impressive young lady. And an impressive young lady Dido was. Though her position at Kenwood House was extremely unusual, given that she was technically a slave according to colonial law and had not been granted her freedom, the Mansfields made the revolutionary decision to raise Dido as Lady Elizabeth's companion and equal. The idea that a biracial child born into slavery could be raised as a member of one of the most influential aristocratic families in all of England was so unheard of that it bordered on preposterous. It's important to note that Dido's status as illegitimate was almost equally looked down upon. Tragically, illegitimate children at the time were often abandoned and faced numerous disadvantages in life, including a lack of education, lack of work opportunities, and an inability to get married. To the outside world, Dido had every stack against her. But inside the walls of Kenwood House, she was provided the remarkable opportunity to become an educated, cultivated, and accomplished young woman. The Mansfields made sure that Dido was given an extensive education. She would have been taught to read and write, taken lessons in history, geography, and French, and taught to play a musical instrument. She would have also been trained in ballroom dancing, given drawing lessons, and even learned to ride a horse. In fact, her education was so impressive that a man named James Beattie mentioned Dido in his book, Elements of Moral Science, after meeting her at Kenwood House. As Beattie wrote, "I happened a few days after to see a black girl about 10 years old, who would have been 6 years in England, and not only spoke with the articulation and accent of a native, but repeated some pieces of poetry with a degree of elegance which would have been admired in any English child of her years." Clearly, Beattie was so impressed with Dido that he sought to record and share her story with the world. And Dido was not only provided an elite education, she was also given extremely luxurious accommodations. We know that Dido had a private suite within the family's quarters, with her own bathroom and dressing room. Her rooms were decorated lavishly with stylish furniture and fixtures, and she would have been at liberty to explore Kenwood's massive estate, which had over 50 rooms. She was given an annual allowance of £20, with an additional £5 for both her birthday and Christmas. And whenever she fell ill, she was treated with expensive and advanced medical care. All of these luxuries attest to Dido's high position within the household, and that she was clearly respected and treated as a member of the family. Dido was particularly close to Lady Elizabeth, who, despite being her second cousin, felt more like a sister and best friend. We can imagine the two girls running around Kenwood House's massive grounds together, playing amiably within their own protected bubble, despite their clear difference in race and status. Dido also spent a lot of time with Lady Mansfield, helping her tend to Kenwood's many beautiful flower gardens. And she would have been well doted upon by Lord Mansfield, who spoiled her and Lady Elizabeth as if they were her own daughters. We can only imagine that Dido not only felt wholly loved and accepted by the Mansfields, but also comfortable and safe within Kenwood's walls. Though not much is known about Dido's personality, we do get somewhat of a sense from journal entries of various guests to Kenwood House over the years. One entry describes Dido as pert, another as not genteel. In an age when etiquette and politeness was of utmost importance, it seems that Dido was unafraid to show her strong personality. This is especially remarkable considering her race and status, which would have put her at a clear disadvantage. Though many may have expected her to make herself small, Dido was instead both a confident and cheeky girl, undeterred by society's standards. As we will later see, her playful expression in her portrait only further attests to her fearless and zesty character. As Dido grew older, she was given important responsibilities within the Mansfields' household. She supervised the estate's poultry and dairy farm, a role typically assigned to gentlewomen, and she clearly did an exceptional job. When Thomas Hutchinson, an American settler and former governor of Massachusetts, visited Kenwood House in 1779, he took particular note of Dido's impeccable management. As he wrote, "She is a sort of superintendent over the dairy and poultry yard, which we visited, and she was called upon by my lord every minute for this thing and that, and showed the greatest attention to everything he said." Hutchinson's observations not only indicate Dido's immense skillfulness, but also Lord Mansfield's increasing dependence upon her. It's also clear from Hutchinson's remarks that Lord Mansfield was extremely proud of Dido and enthusiastically showed her off to guests of the estate. Dido was a valued part of the family, and Lord Mansfield made sure that Dido was appreciated by all. But even with Lord Mansfield's unconditional love, there was still the unavoidable fact that to the outside world, Dido was still both biracial and illegitimate, and would not be fully accepted into society. Though the Mansfields did their best to treat Dido as an equal within their family, they did have to make some concessions. Dido did not join the Mansfields at church, nor on family outings. She was also not allowed to attend galas and balls, even one thrown in Lady Elizabeth's honor. How did Dido feel to have to be left behind, especially when Lady Elizabeth was allowed to join? Did she feel the weight of the world in these moments, the injustice that because of her skin color and birth status, she would always be treated differently? As she watched her family leave the estate from her window, did Dido shed any tears? We can only imagine how isolating this must have been for Dido, and that in these moments she was forced to reckon with the harsh realities of the world she lived in. Unfortunately, it was not just outside of Kenwood House that Dido was at times kept hidden. Dido was also excluded from dinners held for guests of the estate. We can imagine that at first, many of these guests may have assumed that Dido was a servant, not a beloved member of their family. As much as the Mansfields accepted her, it would have been hard for Dido to be as openly accepted by the English aristocracy. As author Fergus Mason wrote, "It was not unheard of for a powerful aristocrat to be the legal guardian to an illegitimate relation, but it was extremely unusual at this time for a mixed heritage child who had been born to an enslaved mother to be raised not as a servant, but as part of an aristocratic British family." We can imagine that the Mansfields' decision to exclude Dido from dinner parties was less to do with wanting to hide her, as it was to protect her from outsiders' judgment or worse, vitriol. They clearly sought to spare her the unnecessary questions and stares, and would not have wanted her to feel looked down upon. But though Dido was not allowed to dine with guests, she did join them in the drawing room after dinner to take coffee, and later to walk the estate's impressive gardens. These guests, who included acting governors, important American settlers, and some of the highest members of the British aristocracy, were absolutely shocked by Dido's presence. And while the Mansfields may have been discreet at dinner, they certainly did not hide the fact that Dido was a valued member of their family in these after hours. It's nothing short of remarkable to imagine Dido sipping coffee, surrounded by some of the most powerful men of England and the New World, as they sat, baffled by her attendance. Thomas Hutchinson, the American visitor who described Dido's work in the dairy farm, also took note of her company after dinner in his private diary. As he wrote, "A black came in after dinner and sat with the ladies, and after coffee, walked with the company in the gardens. One of the young ladies having her arm around the other. She had a very high cap, and her wool was much frizzled in her neck. I knew her history before, but my lord mentioned it again. He calls her Dido, which I suppose is all the name she has. He knows he has been reproached for showing a fondness for her. I dare say, not criminal." Hutchinson's candid remarks not only give us a sense of an outsider's sentiment regarding Dido and her inclusion within the Mansfield's family, but present a rare primary source attesting to just how beloved by them she was. He describes Dido linking arms with Lady Elizabeth as they walk, and Lord Mansfield showing a particular fondness for her, something that Hutchinson does not seem to approve of. It's clear that the Mansfields were not ashamed of Dido, and while she wasn't included in formal dinners, they made an effort to show their guests that she was still just as much a part of their family. We do have to wonder, how did Dido feel about her particular position? Was she saddened to be excluded in certain aspects of their life? Or did she understand that the Mansfields were doing all they could to protect her? And how did she feel about her immense privilege? Did she ever think about what her life might have been like had she not been brought to England and raised at Kenwood House? That her mother was a slave, and that she would be considered one too by conventional law? Did she feel a sense of guilt that while she was living a life of luxury, others just like her were enslaved or impoverished? To get a sense of just how much an anomaly Dido was, it's important to contextualize her unique situation within the experience of most Black men and women living in London at the time. By the mid to late 18th century, there were approximately 15,000 Black people living in London. Many were slaves brought from the West Indies by their masters. Others, escapees who found refuge in London. And some freed men and women who had made their way to London after the end of the 7 Years' War. We know from depictions from this time, most famously by the artist Hogarth, that these Black men and women were living under squalid conditions. Crammed into lower-class areas of the city, they would have been vulnerable to disease, largely illiterate, and left to fend for themselves. However, despite their desperate situation, they also began to form close-knit communities of resistance and resilience. They formed churches, musical societies, and even support groups for runaway slaves. We can imagine that Dido's mother would have lived and moved amongst these communities. Dido would have occasionally been driven around London in the family carriage. How did she feel as she looked out the window and saw men and women who looked like her living under such impoverished conditions? When she saw Black slaves or servants attending their white masters? Was she filled with a sense of sadness, guilt, and pain? Did she worry about her mother and her safety? Or did she decide to detach herself from the harsh realities of the world around her? What Dido could not have known at this time was that one of the most significant steps towards establishing protective rights for slaves in London was brewing right under her very roof. When Dido was still a young child, Lord Mansfield was called to rule over one of the most significant cases pertaining to slavery in the history of England. And unbeknownst to her, her presence in his life may have been the driving force behind his revolutionary decision. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Hey listeners, Grace Anna here, host of ArtMuse. I wanted to share another art-centered podcast with you called The Art of Crime, a podcast that delves into the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. Host Gavin Whitehead shares extensively researched episodes with gripping stories bringing art history and true crime together in a brilliant way. Learn about the attempted assassination of Benvenuto Cellini, the various artists who have been accused of being Jack the Ripper, or Madame Tussauds and her Chamber of Horrors, among many other fascinating topics. The Art of Crime podcast is currently in its 4th season, which focuses on art-related crimes in New York City. To learn more about the Art of Crime podcast, you can visit their website at www.artofcrimepodcast.com or find them on all streaming platforms where you can listen and subscribe. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. In 1772, Lord Mansfield was summoned to judge over a case titled Somerset v. Stuart. James Somerset was a slave who was brought to England by his master, Charles Stuart. Shortly after his arrival, Somerset ran away. After an intense search, Stuart found and recaptured Somerset and as punishment, sold him to the captain of a slave ship bound for the West Indies. Before Somerset departed, abolitionists caught news of his situation and petitioned for his case to go to trial. The crux of their position was whether it was lawful for a slave who had already escaped to be sent out of the country against his will. When Lord Mansfield was first approached with the case, he tried his best to prevent it from going to trial. He knew that there was an immense amount of pressure from both sides. On the one hand, from abolitionists to establish legal protection for slaves, and on the other hand, from the white upper classes who were not only greatly profiting off of slavery, but had centered England's entire economy around it. Lord Mansfield even suggested to the abolitionists that it would be easier if they bought Somerset his freedom than going to trial, but they refused. There was no getting around it. Lord Mansfield would be forced to make a decision that would have a significant and lasting effect on all of England, and no matter which party he sided with, it would undoubtedly result in an uproar. To increase the pressure, the press began heavily covering the case, and it dominated the news for the duration of the trial. There were many who expected Lord Mansfield to rule that Somerset, as a slave, was a piece of property, and therefore did not have free will over who he belonged to and where he was sent. This would have satisfied the vast majority of England's white population, and protected the system of slavery that England's economy had become dependent upon. But instead, Lord Mansfield made the revolutionary decision that slaves could not be forcibly removed from England. And in his ruling, he not only granted Somerset his freedom, but used the opportunity to criticize the very nature of slavery itself, famously calling it odious. As he decreed, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only positive law. It's so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from a decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. Though Mansfield clarified that this decision was meant to apply to Somerset's specific case, the public understood the ruling to mean that slavery was now illegal in England. This was not necessarily correct. The decision only prohibited slave owners from sending slaves out of England against their will. But it marked a significant step towards abolition nonetheless. The decision left plantation owners furious, who not only feared their slaves in England would expect freedom, but that the entire transatlantic slave trade was now in jeopardy. But the black communities of England celebrated the decision as a massive triumph, even hosting a ball at a public house for over 200 guests. Abolitionists were equally thrilled over the ruling, using it as an argument that slavery was abolished in England. As one abolitionist wrote, "The great and glorious result of the trial was that as soon as ever any slave set his foot upon English territory, he became free." Regardless of the liberties abolitionists took in their interpretation of the case, the decision undoubtedly shifted the public's consciousness and became a catalyst for the abolitionist movement to grow. It also discouraged slave owners from bringing their slaves to England, which caused the number of slaves in England to drop sharply. While slavery in the colonies remained strong, and it would be another 35 years before the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, the Somerset ruling was one of the most significant steps towards emancipation in the history of slavery. And it was Mansfield who was celebrated as the man who outlawed slavery in England. Newspaper articles stated that Mansfield's ruling meant slaves could breathe free air in England, and was celebrated as a hero amongst the black communities and abolitionists. Many believe that his decision must have been influenced by his experience of raising Dido. Gossip around London spread that Mansfield had, quote, chosen the cause of his own black niece over that of the merchants and planters who had made the nation rich. One slave owner furiously declared, "No doubt the slave will be set free, for Lord Mansfield keeps a black in his house, which governs him and the whole family." The idea that Lord Mansfield's love for Dido may have swayed his decision is nothing short of extraordinary. Is it possible that Dido was on Lord Mansfield's mind when he made his revolutionary ruling? Did Dido change the way that he viewed slavery? Was he worried for her safety should a day come when he could not protect her? Was he trying to make a better world for her to live in? Dido was only a small child at the time of the Somerset ruling, but it does beg the question, was Dido aware of Lord Mansfield's decision and the implications it had on slavery? Did she know that she had inadvertently changed the course of history simply by being herself? There certainly was one slave whose life changed around this time, Dido's mother, Maria. Records show that Maria remained in London until Dido was around the age of 12. Dido would have by this time been well established at Kenwood House, and Maria must have taken great pride in knowing how well cared for her daughter was. And while we do not know exactly where Maria lived or worked, interestingly, there are indications that Sir Lindsay kept in touch with her and may have given her financial support. But what is most remarkable is that shortly after Mansfield's Somerset ruling, Sir Lindsay officially granted Maria her freedom. And more than this, he arranged for a plot of land in Pensacola, Florida, to be transferred under her name. This meant that not only was Maria no longer legally a slave, but that she was the owner of her own plot of land in America. After 28 years of slavery and servitude, Maria was free at last. How did Maria feel to finally gain her freedom, and more so, to be a landowner in the New World? Was she excited to start her new life, or was she heartbroken that she would be even further removed from Dido's life? In August of 1774, Maria left England for Florida on a naval vessel, transportation we can assume Sir Lindsay arranged for her. As she arrived with her manumission paper in hand, she would have proudly made her way to take possession of her plot of land. We know from a map of Pensacola from 1781 that Maria's land was well positioned, with views of the harbor and facing the main part of town. This plot would have been well sought after and considered to be of high status. It's nothing short of amazing to imagine a woman who had begun her life in West Africa, was captured and enslaved by the Spanish, and moved to England, where she continued to work in domestic service, was now the owner of expensive land. Maria lived out the rest of her life as a free woman here in Pensacola, in her very own home that she built on her very own land. We do not know if Dido learned of her mother's fortunate fate, but we can only imagine that while she must have been relieved to hear of her mother's freedom and promising new life, that she would have felt her absence in her own life all the more. Unfortunately, so much of Dido's personal experience and inner feelings have been lost to history. We are left to imagine and intuit most details of her life. But perhaps one of the most telling sources we do have that gives us a window into Dido's unique personality is the sole surviving portrait of her. Portrait of Dido Elizabeth Belle Lindsay and Lady Elizabeth Murray was commissioned by Lord Mansfield in 1779. The portrait was originally attributed to the painter Johann Zoffany, but has since been verified by the Scottish National Gallery as a work of the portraitist David Martin. The painting is a double portrait of Dido alongside Lady Elizabeth. In the portrait we see Lady Elizabeth seated on a bench with a book. Behind her, Dido playfully runs by as Lady Elizabeth stretches her arm outwards to catch her, a gesture that speaks to their friendship. Both girls are dressed in fine gowns, Dido's a silky white and Lady Elizabeth a pink lace. In the background, one can see London's St. Paul Cathedral, placing the scene at their home of Kenwood House. The portrait is clearly a tribute to Lord Mansfield's great nieces, whom he raised and loved as his own children. But more than this, it stands as a testament to Dido's remarkable life and the historical significance that her presence at Kenwood House held. As author Paula Byrne eloquently wrote, "Portraits tell stories, and this one tells a story of a love and sisterhood, unity between black and white, vitality and virtue. A story, furthermore, that brings us to the very heart of a larger historical story, the abolition of the slave trade. In its simplest terms, it is a portrait of two girls, one biracial, one white, caught in an innocent moment of play, at a time when their friendship would have shocked the world. Despite her race, it's clear from Dido's extravagant outfit that she is Lady Elizabeth's equal. Garbed in a white and gold satin gown, expensive pearl necklace, and pearl earrings to match, Dido is every bit an elegant aristocratic lady. This alone was extremely unusual, as it was virtually unheard of for a woman of color to be so exquisitely dressed. At the same time, there are a number of details that place Dido's portrayal more in line with other contemporary depictions of women of color. To start, Dido's head is wrapped in a white turban, with a large ostrich feather poking out of its top. Billowing from her shoulders is a sheer turquoise shawl, and in her arms she carries a basket of foreign fruit. All of these details are meant to exoticize Dido and emphasize her otherness. As the English heritage site eloquently put it, the basket of tropical fruit she carries and the turban with expensive feathers that she wears suggest an exotic difference from her and her more conventionally styled white cousin, who is sitting reading a book. Though there is no indication that Dido herself would have worn a turban or carried around fruit, viewers would have understood these details as symbols of Dido's own foreignness. Dido is also subtly sexualized, another common trope amongst depictions of women of color from this time. Though she could be no older than 15 years old, there are a number of details that eroticize Dido's image. The silk of her gown suggestively clings to her lower body, drawing the viewer's eye towards her navel, and the outline of her thigh is emphasized as she motions forward. Compared to her counterpart Lady Elizabeth, whose figure is well hidden under her puffy gown, Dido's rendering leaves much less to the viewer's imagination. Yet despite, or perhaps in spite, of these more stereotypical undertones, there is no denying that the portrait of Dido and Lady Elizabeth was revolutionary by its very nature. To date, there are no other known examples from 18th century England of a portrait depicting a biracial woman and white woman as equals, let alone in a sisterly pose. Lady Elizabeth's affectionate hand gesture towards Dido implies that the two young women have a familial bond. Dido is not only a beloved friend and family member, but is clearly the same status as her white companion. As Ama Asante, the director of the film Belle, wrote, "You see a biracial girl, a woman of color, who's depicted slightly higher than her white counterpart. She's staring directly out with a very confident eye. This painting flipped tradition and everything the 18th century told us about portraiture. It seems that Dido not only defied the societal constraints of her time through her lived experience, but also through her portrait. Its presence just as revolutionary as its subject herself." There is no doubt that Dido is the heart and soul of the painting. She steals the attention of any viewer to the work with her shining eyes, bursting energy, and enigmatic smile. And her smile is made all the more alluring by the peculiar position of her finger, which points at her chin in a quizzical manner. The meaning behind her pointed finger is yet another mystery, and brings forward equally revolutionary possibilities. One suggestion is that her pointed finger implies that Dido is keeping a secret. Historically, in the tradition of Western portraiture, a pointed finger indicates that something is being kept hidden from the viewer. As she playfully points her finger towards her mysterious smile, Dido is perhaps alluding to the greater mystery of her own life, as if she is saying, "I'm here against all odds, and I'm not going anywhere." Others interpret her finger as a way to draw emphasis to her skin tone, especially in contrast to Lady Elizabeth's white complexion. But recent analysis suggests a new and fascinating possibility. In 2010, scholar Christine Kenyon Jones proposed a theory that Dido's pose alludes to the Hindu deity Krishna. According to Jones, there is a sculpture that depicts Krishna in a similar pose, and that the pose refers to an important anecdote. As the Hindu story goes, one day Krishna took on the appearance of his sister, and after that her husband. He was later reprimanded for taking on their appearances as an abuse of his power, and slapped in the face by a fellow deity. Yet instead of recoiling in pain, Krishna smiled and pointed at his bruised cheek, explaining that he was trying to show that he, his sister, and her husband are all one and the same. If Dido were referencing Krishna and this story, her pose could be communicating a similar message. that she and her white cousin are also one and the same. As author Caitlin Davies suggested, what Dido's pose apparently proclaims, therefore, is that she and her cousin share the same humanity and innate worthiness. Though we cannot know with certainty if the portrait is in fact referencing Krishna and his important message, the possibility is nothing short of enthralling. And of course, one of the many other mysteries Dido's enigmatic smile holds is how Dido herself felt about the portrait. In fact, we are even unsure if Dido would have seen the portrait, as some records indicate that the painting was not kept at Kenwood House during her lifetime. It does beg the questions. How did Dido feel about the painting? Was she happy with its outcome? What was the experience of modeling for her very own portrait like? Could she believe that she was being portrayed on canvas as Lady Elizabeth's equal? And why was she posed in such an unusual way? Was her playful position Dido's own idea? Or was she under the direction of the artist? And, perhaps most importantly, what is the true meaning behind Dido's mystifying smile? I hope you have enjoyed part 1 of our 2-part episode on Dido Elizabeth Belle. We will finish Dido's story and honor her immense legacy in part 2 of this episode. I have included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.